Okay. All righty. Good morning. Good morning. Good morning. Welcome, welcome, welcome. Happy Thursday. Thursday. All right. Yes, not Friday. All right. Today is going to be a fun one because today we're going to be talking about celiac. We're going to be talking about bowel disorders. So, hello on YouTube, hello on Instagram. Um, Yeah, we're going to talk about what's going on, what it is, where does it come from. I'll try to keep this to about a half hour, so I'll go through my notes so I stay on time here. Um, yes, happy Friday Eve. I like that. I like that a lot. All right. So, let's just jump right into it. Um, I guess actually, yeah, let's jump right into it. I'll cover everything at the end. Well, let's do it this way. So, if you haven't, I'm going to be doing a talk Tuesday night, which is May 2nd at 6 p.m. Going to be talking about opportunities to be working with, regenerative food. So, if that's something you want to bring into your life, either to use or to share with other people, that's going to be an available opportunity. So, if you want to get in touch with that or involved with that, I should say, check my message me. I could send you the link. I'll post something on my story on Instagram. We could do something there. Um, that's probably the big announcement. So other than that, let's get right into it because that's the most time sensitive one. So we're going to be talking about bowel disorders and celiac. So first, we have to talk about the digestive tract in general a little bit. And more importantly, we have to talk about what is regeneration and reversing disease. So in my career, it's really been my goal to help um, really help others realize that they can regenerate because the body only knows how to do one thing. It knows how to heal. The question is, do we end up getting in our own way? Do we throw in a lot of acidity, toxins that just impair our ability to do that? So take it for what you will. That is kind of really what my goal is. It's not necessarily about looking at things like symptoms or even what we call diseases or autoimmune diseases like celiac, because that all that is a constellation of symptoms. And the question is, why is that happening? Just because you might have a genetic predisposition to something does not necessarily mean that it's going to activate. It's only activated through the lifestyle choices either we copy or mimic that our parents or family does, or it's something that we've kind of brought into our own life. And when we're talking about reversing disease and regeneration, there are really five things that are important. It's how well do you assimilate nutrients? Can you excrete waste? Are we able to allow the body to grow? Are we able to reproduce either as a species or at a cellular level? So from the micro all the way up to the macro. And then are we able to adapt? Our environment is always adapting. So it's assimilation of nutrients, excretion of waste, growth, reproduction, adaptation. Very simply put, if you are doing something that's going to improve one of those five things, you're on the road to regeneration. If you are not, if you are impairing one of those five things, you are on the way towards disease. Simply put, that's what it is. So, any action you take that's going to support those is good, and anything that impairs them is going to be an issue. And the truth is, the body has an innate intelligence. Some call it intelligent design. I like intelligent design. Um, we are able to regulate and heal ourselves. Now, I've talked about this before because this is going to also relate to celiac and bowel disorders. 97 to 90% of all illnesses, or what we call disease, are stress, toxicity, and acidity. Three things. Stresses come in three flavors. We have physical, chemical, and emotional. And a lot of those fall under a lot of chemical stresses, particularly when we're talking about toxins and acidic foods and stuff. We'll get into that in a little bit, but also toxic emotions. So self-doubt's a big thing. There's a ton of different issues with that. So it's important to kind of keep that in mind. Now, we all inherit certain genetic traits. But again, genetics loads the gun. Lifestyle is what ends up pulling the trigger. So just because we inherit a certain gene does not necessarily mean that it's going to express itself. And even if it does, are there ways that we can reverse that? And turns out that's what we're going to talk about. Now, your GI tract is really important. It's essentially the hub of your body. And this is what I love talking about with iridology, because if you look at an iris chart, you'll actually see that the digestive tract, the stomach, the intestines are essentially at the middle, and all the organs in the body essentially come off of that. Now, that might sound a little maybe ridiculous or esoteric if maybe you're new to the space, but we already know. You can look at books like Gut, where we already know things like the gut brain connection exist, where we have links through the vagus nerve that can literally talk. There is a line of communication between the gut and the brain. We know the gut is the place where most of our dopamine and over 90% of our serotonin is actually produced. That is largely used outside of the gut, right? In our nervous system. So, if there is something wrong with the gut, it tends to affect other areas of the body. And like just a short list of like some of the side effects that can come from an inflammatory bowel disease. It could be something like malabsorption or starvation. Now it might not be literal starvation. It could just be the starvation of cells because the gut is damaged. Gastritis, enteritis, any of your itises, your inflammation. Diverticulitis is a big one. Gas, diarrhea, constipation, parasites. What's going on, Doc? Nice to see you. Crohn's, different types of cancers of the GI tract. Colon cancer is I believe the fastest growing cancer at this point in at least America. Um, Appendicitis, lymphatic congestion. Most of our lymphatic system is located right around that gut, our immune system. So when you hear lymphatic system, think immune system. They're almost one and the same. Nausea. When we're talking about inflammatory bowel disease in general or damage to the intestines, remember inflammation means tissue damage. That's essentially what inflammation is a sign of, is that there is tissue damage. Now that doesn't necessarily mean it's a bad thing, right? If I cut my finger, you know, uh, we're going to want inflammation to that area so it can clot, so it can bring more blood to the area so it can start to heal. But when it's kind of up and going for a very long period of time, it's going to be a big issue. So inflammatory bowel disease, we have really like two main flavors of that usually. It's really Crohn's disease and ulcerative colitis. Now, some of the symptoms that come along with that are usually diarrhea, abdominal cramps, fever, could have issues with the eyes, could be like muscle aches and pains or joints. Skin is usually a big thing. So if there is IBD, I see very often you have what we would call autoimmune issues. So psoriasis, eczema, skin breakouts are very common. Liver gallbladder congestion is a big one because it's going to affect our detoxification pathways. And a lot of that is usually kind of where this is going to come from. And remember, like if you go the conventional route, it's usually one of two ways it's going to go. You're going to get some sort of anti-inflammatory drug, or you're going to get surgery. So so they don't in the conventional model, they look at this and say there's no way to treat it. There's nothing you can do. You either cut it or you just manage the symptoms with usually steroids or something of the like. And officially they will call it idiopathic. And idiopathic literally means I don't know. They don't know what's going on. And we're going to go over how that's not necessarily true. We're going to keep it as friendly as we can for the sensors and such here, but we are going to go into some of the main reasons as we can here. So that's inflammatory bowel disease. You generally have two flavors. It's Crohn's disease or ulcerative colitis. Crohn's disease usually can happen anywhere in the intestines. It's usually in pockets. Ulcerative colitis is usually more located just in the colon, but they generally have similar they lead to similar symptomology. That, I guess, let's put it that way. Then we have diverticulitis. Now, a diverticulum is essentially a blind tube leading from a cavity or passage. So it's essentially like a dead end outpouching of the intestines. So it's an outpouching of the mucosa, the lining of the colon, and it essentially the muscle of the colon starts to weaken and it balloons. So what can happen is it could lead to some issues. Itis means inflammation. So diverticulitis, you're going to have inflammation of a diverticula. Now, again, so it's an inflammation of an outpatching, usually of the colon. Um, Diverticulosis is when essentially you have diverticula within the colon. So, where do we notice this? Where is diverticulosis becoming an issue? It's usually going to be in areas where there's low fiber intake, where there's high red meat consumption, where there's a lot of processed foods. Places where it's most common are the US and Australia. That is not surprising given kind of what I'm saying. In areas that are less prone to this include places like most of Asia and Africa. They tend to include more fiber rich foods, more plants and vegetables, thus usually see fewer outbreaks of diverticulitis. Conventional treatment, again, if you go that route, usually are antibiotics or steroids or surgery. Now, again, why is fiber important? If you think of the digestive tract, it's effectively like a muscle and it pushes things along, especially the small intestine. It'll push things along from time every 90 minutes or so. Usually, we have a peristalsis. It's called peristalsis. It's a peristaltic wave that pushes things forward. Now, in the colon, that doesn't necessarily happen the same way, but there is a muscular tone, and that's sort of set from the nervous system, like the vagus nerve. So, and if that's weakened or if that message is not as strong as it should be, it could lead to weakening of the muscles in that area, and that could lead to some real big time issues. So, having something that can push this along, this is one of the reasons why fiber is so important because it will help push those things along. So we went over diverticulitis, we went over inflammatory bowel disease. Now we have to go over celiac quick. So celiac, and again, this is according to the Clinic and Experimental uh, Gastroenterology, so it's a journal. Celiac disease is an autoimmune disorder that can occur in genetically predisposed people where the ingestion of gluten leads to the damage in the small intestine. Well, there is damage, but is it autoimmune? Do we know what's going on? Here's what we're going to have to kind of break down. Now, what's actually happening is in the small intestine, we have these little projections. They kind of look like fingers. They're called villi. And on the villi, there's actually microvilli. And these are really where nutrients are absorbed through these villi into the bloodstream so that they can be utilized in the body, right? Um, But what happens is when the villi get damaged, they cannot absorb nutrients properly. Now, it's estimated that like 1 in 100 people worldwide have celiac disease. Roughly 2.5 million Americans are probably undiagnosed. So what's happening here is we have gluten, right? Gluten's the big thing in celiac disease that causes the issue, supposedly. So gluten is a protein, essentially. It is a protein. And when gluten cannot be broken down into the amino acids, and remember the point of digestion, we go back to the phases, the 5 keys of health. Assimilation of nutrients is number one. So can we break down proteins into amino acids? If we cannot do that, that is going to lead to some issues. Gluten is one of those proteins that should be broken down into amino acids because we can only absorb and utilize fatty acids, simple sugars like glucose and fructose, and amino acids. So we cannot digest whole proteins. If whole proteins are starting to make their way through the digestive tract, that's going to trigger an immune response. And that's essentially what's happening in celiac disease. So these gluten proteins are not totally broken down in the intestine. Because there is leaky gut, these holes are a little bit wider and more open than they should be. They open up. Um, Larger undigested proteins can get through, like gluten. Um, and what happens is it stimulates a response from the immune system. And again, where is most of our immune system located? It's in lymphatic tissue that is right around the gut lining. Usually, this is done by T cells. The body recognizes these peptides and they consider it an antigen, and it initiates a immune response. And now you start getting damage to some of the intestinal lining. So, as far as the mechanism, as far as what's happening, that is kind of what's known. Now, the real question is, why are some people having an issue with this and not others? And again, we're going to get into the reasons in a little bit, but ultimately, that's what's happening. We're getting undigested proteins like gluten that are able to make their way through the gut lining. It initiates an immune response, leads to inflammation. Now we have some real issues when it comes to celiac disease. That's when we're getting some of the symptoms associated with it. So I mentioned this a couple times. We have to talk about, again, this gut brain connection, which is what we call actually the enteric nervous system, or the second brain. Now, this consists of neurons that are embedded along the gut. So we actually have neurons that are connected to the gut lining. Estimated it contains somewhere between like 100 million neurons, and then more than either the spinal cord or the peripheral nervous system. So there's actually more nerves connected to the gut than our peripheral nervous system. So that's all our muscles, all our extremities. We have more of that in the gut, and they help play a role in breaking down food, absorbing nutrients, expelling wastes. 90% of the fibers from this enteric nervous system uh, are from the primary visceral nerve, which is the vagus nerve, carry information from the gut to the brain. So 90% of it is sensory information. So it's telling 90% of these 100 million neurons are just sending signals to the brain as far as what to do. The enteric nervous system itself uses more than 30 neurotransmitters, just like the brain. And we know that 95% of the body's serotonin, about 50%, a little bit more of dopamine is actually found in the intestines, in the bowels. That's actually where this is created. So, what are some of the most common symptoms that we see when we're talking about celiac disease? Well, in kids, usually you'll see abdominal pain and bloating, chronic diarrhea, vomiting, constipation. You might have pale, foul-smelling stools or fatty stools, which is undigested fat. You might have weight loss. You might have inability to thrive. You might have ADHD, fatigue. You might have dental enamel defects. There's a lot of things that could come on. Delayed growth and delayed puberty. In adults, you might have an unexplained iron deficiency anemia, fatigue, bone or joint pain, arthritis or osteoporosis, depression or anxiety, skin rashes. You might get numbness and tingling in the hands and feet. You might get seizures and migraines. You might have experience infertility or bouts of it, or you might miss your menstrual period occasionally. You could be more prone to things like canker sores. Now, long term, obviously, we're talking about then issues with miscarriage, again, iron deficiency anemia, malabsorption, which is again step one. So, vitamin and mineral deficiencies, pancreas insufficiency because our digestive tract is not functioning as well as it should, gallbladder issues, lymphomas, and other cancers. Because again, that's where most of our immune system is. It's through the lymphatic system. Neurological issues because our nervous system has so many endings in the gut. You're talking about potential dementia, migraines, neuropathy, myopathy, muscle pain, seizures potentially because of all of this there. And when we're talking about conventional treatment,